The year was 1847, and across the wild lands of Texas, people told scary stories about a man they called Iron Wolf. Mothers would hush their crying babies by whispering his name. Children would peek from behind their mothers' skirts when travelers spoke of him around campfires. Even grown men, tough cowboys and soldiers, would lower their voices when they talked about the Comanche war chief who had never lost a battle. Iron Wolf wasn't just any warrior. At 28 years old, he had spent 10 long years fighting to protect his people's hunting grounds. The white settlers kept coming, taking more and more land, and Iron Wolf stood between them and his tribe like a fierce guardian. His real name was Sinatahir, which meant strong as thunder in his language, but the settlers only knew him by the name that made them shiver with fear. The stories about him grew bigger with each telling. They said he could ride his horse for days without stopping to rest. They said his war paint was so frightening that even experienced cavalry officers would shake when they saw him coming. Some claimed he had magic powers that made bullets miss him. Others whispered that he could appear and disappear like smoke in the wind. But Iron Wolf wasn't thinking about scary stories on that cold October morning when everything in his life changed forever. The autumn air was sharp and clean, and the prairie grass moved like ocean waves in the wind. He was leading 12 of his best warriors on a mission that should have been simple. White horse thieves had stolen 30 horses from their herd, including his favorite black stallion, Thunder Runner. For Iron Wolf, this wasn't just about horses. It was about respect. It was about showing that the Comanche people would not be pushed around. The trail was easy to follow at first. 30. Horses leave deep tracks, especially when they're being driven fast by men who don't know the land. Iron Wolf and his warriors moved like shadows across the prairie, following the thieves toward the Brazos River. They rode in single file, their horses' hooves making soft sounds on the grass. Each warrior carried his bow, lance, and war axe. Their faces were painted for battle, and eagle feathers decorated their black hair. Iron Wolf rode at the front, his eyes scanning the horizon like a hawk watching for prey. He had done this many times before. Catch the thieves, take back the horses, and send a message that stealing from the Comanche was a mistake that could cost you your life. But as they got closer to the river, dark clouds began gathering in the sky. The wind picked up, carrying the smell of rain. "Storm coming," said Red Hawk, Iron Wolf's best friend and most trusted warrior. He rode up beside his chief, pointing at the black clouds rolling across the sky like angry spirits. Iron Wolf nodded but didn't slow down. "We catch them before the rain washes away their tracks," he said. His voice was calm and steady, the way it always was before a fight. His warriors had learned to trust that voice. When Iron Wolf spoke like that, things went according to plan. But this time would be different. The first drops of rain started falling just as they spotted the stolen horses in the distance. The thieves had stopped to rest near a creek that fed into the Brazos River. Iron Wolf could see them clearly now. 4 white men sitting around a small fire, drinking coffee and laughing as if they hadn't just committed a crime that could start a war. "Fools," muttered Grey Wolf, the youngest warrior in the group. At 19, he was eager to prove himself in battle. "They act like they're on a picnic." Iron Wolf raised his hand for silence and studied the scene below. The thieves had made camp in a bad spot, too close to the water, with rocks on one side that would block their escape. They had gotten lazy because they thought they were safe in white man's territory. They had no idea that death was watching them from the hilltop above. The rain was getting heavier now, turning the dirt into mud and making the rocks slippery. Iron Wolf divided his warriors into 3 groups. 4 would circle around behind the thieves to block their escape route. 4 more would charge from the left side. Iron Wolf would lead the main attack from the front, using the element of surprise to create confusion and fear. "Remember," Iron Wolf told his men, "we want the horses back, but if they fight, show no mercy. These men are thieves. They chose their path when they took what belongs to us." His warriors nodded and began moving into position. Iron Wolf watched them go, feeling the familiar mixture of excitement and calm that came before battle. This was what he had been born to do: protect his people, defend their honor, and strike fear into the hearts of those who would harm them. But as he prepared to give the signal to attack, his horse suddenly stumbled. Thunder Runner, his most trusted mount, had stepped into a prairie dog hole hidden by the tall grass. The horse went down hard, throwing Iron Wolf forward with tremendous force. Time seemed to slow down as he flew through the air, seeing the sharp limestone rocks rushing up to meet him. The impact was like being hit by lightning. Iron Wolf's head struck a jagged rock and bright lights exploded behind his eyes. He tried to get up, tried to call out to his warriors, but darkness was closing in around him like a heavy blanket. The last thing he heard was the sound of gunfire in the distance as his men attacked without him. When Red Hawk found him 20 minutes later, Iron Wolf was lying motionless among the rocks, blood trickling from a gash on his forehead. Thunder Runner stood nearby, limping but alive, whinnying softly as if apologizing for his mistake. The battle was over. The thieves were dead, and the horses had been recovered, but their great war chief lay unconscious and possibly dying. Red Hawk knelt beside his friend and pressed his ear to Iron Wolf's chest. The heartbeat was weak but steady. There was hope, but not much time. In the distance, he could hear the sound of horses, many horses, coming fast. The gunfire had attracted attention, probably cavalry soldiers from the nearest fort. Chief Lives, Red Hawk called to the other warriors. But barely, we must go now. 2 warriors lifted Iron Wolf's limp body and tried to put him on Thunder Runner's back, but the injured horse couldn't carry him. The sound of approaching horses was getting louder. Soon they would be surrounded by soldiers with rifles and no way to escape. "Leave me," Iron Wolf whispered, his eyes opening for just a moment. Blood was running down his face, and his voice was so weak they could barely hear him. "Save yourselves." Red Hawk looked at his chief, then at the other warriors. They all knew what Iron Wolf would do if their positions were reversed. He would never leave one of them behind. But he would also never let all of them die for the sake of one man, even if that man was their leader. "We cannot carry you and fight soldiers too," Red Hawk said, his voice heavy with grief. "But we will come back for you. I swear by the spirits of our ancestors we will come back." Iron Wolf tried to nod, but the movement made his head spin. The darkness was pulling him down again and he couldn't fight it anymore. The last thing he heard was the sound of his warriors riding away, their horses' hooves pounding on the wet ground as they disappeared into the storm. The cavalry soldiers arrived 10 minutes later, led by Captain Morrison, a man who had been chasing Iron Wolf for 3 years without success. They found the bodies of the horse thieves and the tracks of many horses, but no sign of the famous Comanche war chief they had been hunting for so long. "Spread out," Captain Morrison ordered his men. "Search everywhere. Iron Wolf has to be here, somewhere." But they searched in the wrong places. They looked in the creek bed and among the trees, thinking any wounded warrior would try to hide near water or cover. They never thought to look among the scattered limestone rocks where a man might lie unconscious, looking like just another shadow in the rain. As the soldiers gave up their search and rode away, Iron Wolf lay alone in the storm. Rain washed the blood from his face and soaked through his buckskin clothing. His body temperature was dropping and his breathing was getting shallower. Without help, he would be dead by morning. But sometimes when things look hopeless, the Great Spirit sends help from unexpected places. 3 miles away, a woman named Rose McKenna was walking through the rain, searching for healing herbs that only grew after storms. She was 24 years old with gentle blue eyes and brown hair that she kept braided down her back. Her husband had died of fever 2 years earlier, leaving her alone in their small cabin near the river. Most women in her situation would have moved back east to live with family, but Rose was different. She had learned the art of healing from an old Mexican woman, and the frontier people needed her skills. Rose carried a leather bag for collecting plants and a walking stick to help her navigate the slippery rocks. She knew these lands better than most people because she had walked them in all kinds of weather, looking for the herbs and roots that could save lives. The storm was perfect for her purpose. It would bring out mushrooms and plants that stayed hidden during dry weather. She was kneeling beside a creek, carefully digging up some wild ginger root, when she heard a sound that made her blood run cold. It was the sound of labored breathing coming from somewhere nearby. Rose looked around but saw nothing except rocks and grass. Then she heard it again. Definitely human, but weak and getting weaker. Getting the unconscious warrior to her cabin was the hardest thing Rose had ever done. He was much heavier than he looked, all muscle and bone from years of riding and fighting. She couldn't carry him, so she had to drag him on a makeshift stretcher, made from tree branches and her shawl. Every few minutes she had to stop and rest, her arms aching and her back screaming in pain. The storm was getting worse. Rain poured down like someone had opened the floodgates of heaven, and lightning split the sky with jagged fingers of fire. Rose's cabin was only a mile away, but it felt like 10 miles as she struggled through the mud and rocks, pulling her, unexpected patient behind her. By the time she reached home, both she and the warrior were soaked to the bone. Rose's small cabin sat in a clearing surrounded by oak trees, with a vegetable garden on one side and a pen for her 2 goats on the other. It wasn't much, but it was sturdy and warm, with thick log walls that could keep out both the weather and unwanted visitors. Inside, Rose faced her next challenge. The warrior was too big for her bed and too dirty to put on her clean sheets anyway. She decided to make a bed on the floor near the fireplace, where the warmth would help fight off the cold that was settling into his body. She spread out thick blankets and managed to roll him onto them, breathing hard from the effort. Under the light of her oil lamps, Rose got her first good look at the man she was trying to save. His war paint was streaked and fading, but she could see the careful patterns that marked him as someone important, probably a war chief judging by the eagle feathers in his hair and the quality of his weapons. His face was strong and angular, with high cheekbones and a straight nose. There were old scars on his arms and chest, proof of many battles survived. But it was his current injuries that worried her most. The head wound was serious, a deep gash that had bled heavily before clotting. His pulse was weak and irregular and his breathing was shallow. These were signs of what doctors called a brain fever, a condition that killed more often than it healed. Rose had seen this before when her husband fell from their roof while fixing shingles. The symptoms were the same: the unconsciousness, the weak breathing, the cold skin. Her husband had lived, but only because she had known exactly what to do. Now she prayed that the same treatments would work on a Comanche warrior. First, she needed to clean his wounds and get him warm. Rose heated water over her fire and gathered her medical supplies: clean cloth, healing herbs, and a bottle of whiskey that she used for sterilizing cuts. Working by lamplight, she carefully washed the blood and dirt from his head wound, checking for pieces of rock or debris that might cause infection. The gash was deep, but clean. Rose applied a paste made from honey and crushed garlic, an old remedy that prevented wounds from going bad. Then she bandaged his head with strips of clean linen, wrapping them carefully to keep the dressing in place without being too tight. Next came the harder part: getting him out of his wet clothes. Rose had never undressed a man other than her husband, and certainly never a Comanche warrior who might wake up at any moment. But his buckskin shirt and leggings were soaked through, and keeping wet clothes on a man with brain fever was like signing his death warrant. Working quickly and trying not to think about the impropriety of it all, Rose removed his wet clothing and covered him with dry blankets. She couldn't help noticing the many scars on his body, old wounds from bullets, knives, and arrows that told the story of a life spent fighting. But there was also something else that surprised her. Among the scars of battle, she saw smaller marks, burn scars on his hands that looked like they came from cooking fires, and calluses that suggested he did more than just fight. For 3 days, the warrior lay unconscious while Rose tended to him. She spooned broth into his mouth drop by drop, most of it running back out, but some getting down his throat. She changed his bandages twice a day and applied fresh herb poultices to prevent infection. She kept the fire burning constantly to maintain warmth in the cabin, and she slept on a chair beside him so she could watch for any changes. On the second night, the fever came. His body temperature shot up like a furnace and he began talking in his sleep. Not in English, but in rapid Comanche that Rose couldn't understand. Sometimes he seemed to be giving orders to warriors. Other times he called out names that might have been family or friends. Most disturbing of all, sometimes he cried out like a man in terrible grief, tears streaming down his face even while unconscious. Rose had seen fever dreams before, but these seemed different. This wasn't just the random babbling of a sick mind. This man was reliving something, memories that caused him great pain even in sleep. She found herself wondering what terrible things he had seen, what losses he had suffered, to make him cry out like a heartbroken child. She fought the fever the way her mentor had taught her, with cool cloths on his forehead, willow bark tea, for the inflammation and constant vigilance. Several times during that long night she thought she was going to lose him. His breathing would become so shallow she could barely detect it, and his pulse would flutter like a dying bird. But each time, just when she thought death was claiming him, he would take a deeper breath and his heart would find its rhythm again. On the third morning, the fever broke. Rose woke from a fitful doze to find his breathing deeper and more regular. His skin was no longer burning hot, and some color was returning to his face. For the first time since she had found him, she allowed herself to hope that he might actually live. That afternoon, his eyes opened. Rose was stirring a pot of stew when she heard him moving on his makeshift bed. She turned to find him staring at her with dark brown eyes that were alert but confused. For a moment, neither of them moved. Rose felt her heart pounding as she realized that the man everyone feared most on the Texas frontier was now awake in her cabin, and she had no idea what he might do. The warrior tried to sit up but immediately groaned and fell back down, his hand going to his bandaged head. He looked around the cabin, taking in the simple furniture, the medical supplies, and the woman standing beside the cooking fire with a wooden spoon in her hand. Rose could see him trying to figure out where he was and how he had gotten there. "You're safe," Rose said softly, knowing he probably didn't understand English but hoping her tone would convey peaceful intentions. "You were hurt. I've been taking care of you." He stared at her for a long moment, then looked down at himself, and seemed to realize that he was wearing one of her husband's old nightshirts instead of his warrior's clothing. His weapons were nowhere in sight. Rose had hidden them in her root cellar, not because she feared he would hurt her, but because she didn't want any neighbors who might drop by to see them and ask questions. The warrior said something in Comanche, probably a question, judging by his tone. When Rose shook her head to show she didn't understand, he tried again in broken Spanish. Rose knew a little Spanish from her dealings with Mexican traders, enough to understand that he was asking where his horse was and what had happened to his men. "I don't know," she replied in Spanish, supplementing her words with gestures. "I found you alone, hurt. Your horse, your men, gone." She could see the grief and worry in his eyes as he absorbed this information. He tried to sit up again, and this time Rose moved to help him, propping pillows behind his back so he could stay upright without strain. The movement brought them close together, and Rose was struck by the fact that this fearsome warrior was really just a young man who had been badly hurt and was now dependent on the kindness of a stranger. Over the next few days, they developed a strange kind of communication. The warrior, who eventually managed to convey that his name sounded like Taina, was clearly intelligent and determined to understand his situation. Rose found herself drawing pictures in the dirt outside her cabin to explain things, while he responded with his own drawings and the few English words he seemed to pick up with remarkable speed. She learned that he had been unconscious for 3 days, which surprised him greatly. She gathered from his gestures that he had been in a fight involving horses and that he was worried about his people. In return, she tried to explain that she was a healer, that she lived alone, and that she had helped him because it was the right thing to do. What surprised Rose most was how gentle he was despite his fearsome reputation. He never made any threatening moves or demanded anything from her. When she brought him food, he always touched his chest and nodded in what was clearly a gesture of thanks. When she changed his bandages, he remained perfectly still and seemed almost embarrassed by the necessity of her care. On the 4th day of his consciousness, something happened that changed everything between them. Rose was in her garden, picking vegetables for the evening meal, when she heard her goats making distressed sounds. She hurried to their pen to find a rattlesnake coiled near the water trough, its tail buzzing a warning that kept the goats pressed against the far corner of their enclosure. Rose had dealt with snakes before, but this one was large and aggressive. and she was alone. As she stood there trying to figure out how to safely remove the threat to her animals, she heard movement behind her. For 3 peaceful weeks, Rose and Sina Tahir existed in a world apart from the hatred and violence that raged across the Texas frontier. During the day, he rested and regained his strength while she went about her daily tasks, tending her garden, caring for her goats, and preparing the healing remedies that brought occasional visitors to her door. In the evenings, they would sit by the fire and continue their slow, patient work of learning to communicate. Sina Tahir proved to be a quick student. Within days, he had learned dozens of English words, and Rose found herself picking up basic Comanche phrases in return. More than language, though, they were learning about each other in ways that went deeper than words. Rose discovered that the man the settlers feared as a merciless savage was actually thoughtful and intelligent, with a gentle sense of humor that emerged as he felt more comfortable in her presence. Through their conversations, conducted in a mixture of English, Comanche, Spanish, and elaborate hand gestures, Rose learned pieces of his story. He drew pictures in the dirt to show her his village, his family, his life before the endless conflicts began. She saw through his eyes how the coming of white settlers had changed everything, how diseases had swept through his people like wildfire, how the buffalo herds that sustained them were being destroyed, how his role as a war chief was really that of a desperate protector trying to save what remained of his world. One evening, as they sat watching the flames dance in her fireplace, Sina Tahir showed Rose a small leather pouch that he wore around his neck. Inside was a lock of black hair so fine it could only have belonged to a child. Through gestures and the few words they shared, he made her understand that it had belonged to his younger sister, who had died in the great sickness that came with the white traders. She had been only 8 years old. "I could not save her," he said in his careful English, touching the pouch gently. "I save everyone else, but not her. Not the most important." Rose felt tears sting her eyes as she watched this fierce warrior mourn a little sister he had lost years before. She thought of her own losses, her husband, the children she and Thomas had hoped to have but never did, and realized that grief was something that connected all people, regardless of the color of their skin or the language they spoke. "You can't save everyone," she told him softly. "We can only do our best and trust God with the rest." Sina Tahir looked at her with those dark, intelligent eyes. "Your God and my Great Spirit," he said slowly. "Maybe same. Maybe they understand why good people must suffer." It was in moments like these that Rose forgot entirely about his reputation, about the stories that made children hide under their beds at the mention of his name. This was just a man who had seen too much death, who carried too much responsibility, who blamed himself for tragedies that were beyond anyone's control. During the days, Sina Tahir helped Rose with tasks around her small homestead. His head wound was healing well, and though he still got dizzy if he moved too quickly, his strength was returning. He repaired her goat pen with the skill of someone who understood how to work with wood and rope. He fixed the loose stones in her chimney, ensuring that smoke would draw properly when the weather turned cold. He even helped her harvest the last of her vegetables before the first frost could claim them. Watching him work, Rose was struck by how different he was from the stories people told. His hands were gentle as he handled her tools, careful not to damage anything. When her goats got loose one morning, he spent an hour patiently coaxing them back into their pen, rather than simply driving them with shouts and force. Everything about him spoke of someone who protected and cared for things, not someone who destroyed them. But their peaceful isolation couldn't last forever. Tom Bradley owned the farm closest to Rose's cabin, about 2 miles downstream along the river. He was a hard man who had come to Texas with nothing and built his holdings through determination and constant suspicion of everyone around him. His wife had died the previous winter from pneumonia, and his 3 sons were grown and gone to seek their own fortunes, leaving him alone with his cattle and his bitter view of the world. Bradley had never liked having Rose as a neighbor. A woman living alone seemed unnatural to him, and he disapproved of her practice of healing anyone who came to her door, regardless of their background. Mexican vaqueros, freed slaves, Even the occasional Indian had been seen coming and going from her cabin, seeking treatment for injuries and illnesses. In Bradley's opinion, Rose McKenna was too trusting for her own good and a potential danger to all the decent white folks in the area. On a crisp November morning, Bradley rode up to Rose's cabin leading a cow that was limping badly. The animal had stepped in a gopher hole and twisted its leg, and while Bradley knew something about doctoring cattle, this injury was beyond his skills. He needed Rose's knowledge of healing, even if he didn't like asking a woman for help. Rose was working in her garden when she heard his horse approaching. She looked up to see Bradley's stern face and felt her stomach tighten with worry. Sina Taher was inside the cabin, and while he had grown strong enough to hide quickly if necessary, the presence of any neighbor was a danger to both of them. "Morning, Tom," Rose called out, forcing her voice to sound casual. "What brings you by?" Bradley dismounted and gestured toward the limping cow. "Got a lame animal here. Figured you might have something that could help her walk again." Rose nodded and wiped her hands on her apron. "Let me take a look." She moved toward the cow, hoping to keep Bradley's attention focused on the animal and away from her cabin. But as she knelt to examine the injured leg, she heard something that made her blood run cold, the soft creak of her cabin door opening. Sina Taher had heard the voices and was probably trying to see what was happening. Rose prayed he would have the good sense to stay hidden, but she could feel Bradley's eyes scanning her property with the suspicious attention he brought to everything. "Looks like a bad sprain," Rose said, working to keep her voice steady as she ran her hands along the cow's leg. "I can make a poultice that will bring down the swelling, but she'll need to stay off it for at least a week." Bradley grunted acknowledgement, but didn't seem to be paying full attention to her diagnosis. His gaze had shifted to her cabin, and Rose saw his eyes narrow as he noticed details that didn't fit with a woman living alone. There were 2 cups sitting on her front step, left over from the morning when she and Sina Taher had shared coffee while watching the sunrise. Beside the door, a pair of moccasins were drying in the sun, moccasins that were clearly made for a man much larger than any white settler in the area. Most damning of all, the scent of sage was drifting from her cabin, burned in the ceremonial way that Indians used it, not the cooking way that white people knew. "You got company, Rose?" Bradley asked, his voice taking on a harder edge. Rose felt her heart hammering against her ribs. "Had a Mexican vaquero come through yesterday," she lied, trying to keep her voice casual. "Poor fellow had been thrown from his horse. I patched him up and sent him on his way this morning." Bradley's eyes didn't leave her cabin. "That's so? Funny thing about Mexicans, they don't usually wear Comanche moccasins." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Rose felt the world spinning around her as she realized that her worst nightmare was coming true. Bradley had seen too much, noticed too many details, and his suspicious nature had put together a picture that was dangerously close to the truth. "I'm sure I don't know what you mean," Rose said, but her voice was shaking now, and they both knew her lie was falling apart. Bradley stepped closer to her, his hand moving instinctively toward the gun on his hip. "I think I better have a look inside your cabin, Rose, just to make sure everything's all right." "You have no right to search my home," Rose said, finding strength in her anger. "I've treated your sick animals and asked nothing in return. I've been a good neighbor to you and everyone else in this area. You will not come into my house and go through my belongings like I'm some kind of criminal." But Bradley was already moving toward her door, his face set with the determination of a man who believed he was about to uncover something terrible. "If you got nothing to hide, then you won't mind me taking a quick look around." Rose ran after him, grabbing his arm. "Tom, please, don't do this." He shook her off easily and pushed open her cabin door. "Hello?" he called into the dim interior. "Anyone home?" For a moment, there was only silence. Rose held her breath, hoping against hope that Sina Taher had found a good hiding place. Then, she heard the soft sound of footsteps, and her heart sank as the Comanche warrior stepped into view. He had put on his own clothes, the buckskin shirt and leggings that Rose had cleaned and mended during his recovery. His long black hair was loose around his shoulders, and though he no longer wore war paint, there was no mistaking what he was. He stood tall and straight despite his recent injuries, facing Bradley with the quiet dignity of a man who had nothing left to lose. Bradley's reaction was everything Rose had feared. His face went white, then red with rage. His hand flew to his gun, and he took a step backward, stumbling in his haste to put distance between himself and the most wanted man on the Texas frontier. "Jesus Christ," Bradley whispered. "It's him, it's Iron Wolf." Tom Bradley rode his horse hard toward the settlement, the dust from his mount's hooves creating a cloud that could be seen for miles across the flat Texas prairie. His mind was racing faster than his horse's legs, filled with the shocking discovery he had made at Rose McKenna's cabin. Iron Wolf, the most feared Comanche warrior on the entire frontier, had been hiding there, healthy and well-fed, obviously cared for by a woman who was supposed to be one of their own. The implications made Bradley's blood boil. How many raids had been planned in that innocent-looking cabin? How much information about settler movements and defenses had Rose passed along to her savage guest? How many good Christian people had died because a traitorous woman had chosen to help their greatest enemy instead of her own people? By the time the sun set that day, everyone within 20 miles knew the story. Bradley told it first to the storekeeper in town, then to the preacher, then to anyone else who would listen. With each telling, the tale grew more scandalous. Rose hadn't just helped a wounded man. She had been harboring a killer, feeding him information, probably sharing her bed with him too. The way Bradley told it, Rose McKenna was worse than a traitor. She was a woman who had sold her soul to the devil himself. The reaction was swift and merciless. Mrs. Patterson, who had been Rose's closest friend since her husband's death, crossed the street to avoid speaking to her when she came to town for supplies. The general store owner, who had always given Rose credit when she was short on cash, suddenly demanded payment in advance for everything. Children who used to wave and call out greetings now ran away when they saw her coming. But the cruelest blow came from the church. Reverend Morrison, a stern man who had never liked Rose's independent ways, stood before his congregation the following Sunday and delivered a sermon about betrayal that left no doubt about his target. He spoke of Judas, who had betrayed Christ, for 30 pieces of silver, and of how some people among them had betrayed their neighbors for reasons that were even more shameful. "There are those who would comfort our enemies," the Reverend thundered from his pulpit, his eyes fixed on the back pew where Rose sat alone, shunned by everyone around her. "Those who would give aid and succor to the very savages who murder our children and steal our livestock. Such people are worse than enemies themselves, for they hide among us like wolves in sheep's clothing." Rose felt every word like a physical blow, but she kept her back straight and her eyes forward. She had come to church because it was what she had always done, and she refused to let fear or shame drive her away from her faith. But when the service ended, and she found herself walking out alone while everyone else clustered together in groups that deliberately excluded her, she wondered if she would ever feel welcome in God's house again. The worst part wasn't the hostile stares or the whispered conversations that stopped when she approached. The worst part was the children. Little ones who had once run to her when they scraped their knees or got bee stings now hid behind their mother's skirts, staring at her with fearful eyes as if she had become some kind of monster overnight. 3. Days after Bradley's discovery, a group of men rode out to Rose's cabin. They weren't an official posse. The territorial marshal was 50 miles away, and they hadn't bothered to wait for proper legal authority. They were just angry neighbors who had decided that Rose McKenna needed to answer for her crimes against her own people. Rose was feeding her goats when she heard them coming. She recognized most of the men, farmers and ranchers she had helped, over the years treating their sick children and injured animals. Now they rode toward her with grim faces and weapons at their sides, looking like they were heading to a hanging. Tom Bradley led the group, of course. Beside him rode Jake Morrison, the preacher's eldest son, and Bill Patterson, whose wife had once considered Rose her dearest friend. There were 8 men in total, enough to make their intentions clear without being so many as to look like a mob. "Rose McKenna," Bradley called out as they approached her cabin. "We need to talk." Rose set down her bucket of goat feed and walked to meet them, her chin raised and her hands steady despite the fear that was gnawing at her insides. "What can I do for you, gentlemen?" You can start by telling us the truth, said Jake Morrison, his father's righteous anger reflected in his young face. How long were you hiding that murdering savage? What did you tell him about our town, our defenses, our people? I told him nothing about anything, Rose replied calmly. I found a wounded man and I helped him heal. That's all I did. And it's all I would do again if faced with the same situation. Bill Patterson leaned forward in his saddle, his weathered face hard with disappointment. Rose, my Mary thought the world of you. She trusted you. We all trusted you. How could you betray us like this? How could you help the very man who's been terrorizing our families for years? Rose looked at each of the faces surrounding her, seeing fear and anger and hurt confusion. These weren't bad men, most of them. They were scared people trying to protect their families in a dangerous land, and in their minds, she had sided with everything that threatened them. I didn't betray anyone, she said quietly. I acted according to my conscience and my Christian duty. When I found that man, he was dying. Would you have me let him die simply because of who he was? Yes. Bradley shouted, his patience finally snapping. That's exactly what any decent person would have done. He's killed our people, Rose. He's stolen our livestock and burned our settlements. He's the enemy. He's a human being, Rose replied, her voice growing stronger. And I'm a healer. I don't choose who to save based on the color of their skin or the language they speak. I help anyone who needs help, and I won't apologize for that. Jake Morrison pulled his rifle from its saddle holster, though he didn't point it directly at Rose. You're going to have to do more than apologize. You're going to have to leave. The words hit Rose like a physical blow. Leave? This was her home, the place where she and her husband had built their life together. Her garden, her cabin, her goats, everything she had was here. This is my land, she said, fighting to keep her voice steady. My husband and I bought it fair and square. You have no right to drive me away. We have the right to protect ourselves, Patterson said, though he sounded less certain than the others. And as long as you're here, we can't trust that our families are safe. How do we know you won't help other Indians? How do we know you're not still in contact with Iron Wolf? Rose felt a flash of anger cut through her fear. Because I'm telling you the truth. I found a dying man, I helped him recover, and he left. That's the beginning, middle, and end of the story. If you can't accept that, then you don't know me at all, despite all the years I've lived among you. But she could see in their faces that her words weren't reaching them. Fear had closed their hearts to reason, and prejudice had poisoned their ability to see her as the same person who had delivered their children and healed their sick animals. In their minds, she had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. You have 1 week, Bradley said finally. Pack up your things and get out of Texas. Go back east where you came from, or go wherever else you want, but don't stay here. If you're still on this land after 7 days, we can't guarantee your safety. The men rode away without another word, leaving Rose standing alone in her yard with the taste of dust and despair in her mouth. She sank down on her front step and buried her face in her hands, finally allowing herself to feel the full weight of what was happening to her. Everything she had built, everything she had worked for, was being taken away because she had chosen compassion over hatred. The life she had made for herself in Texas was ending, not because of anything she had done wrong, but because she had done what she believed was right. Meanwhile, 50 miles to the northwest, Tsina Taher was facing his own reckoning. When he finally reached his band's winter camp in a hidden canyon near the Llano River, he found his people in the midst of preparations for a major raid. His absence had been noted and questioned, and his lieutenant, a young warrior named Scarface, had used the opportunity to challenge Tsina Taher's leadership and authority. "Where have you been?" demanded Running Bear, the old medicine man who served as advisor to the war chiefs. "Your warriors returned days ago with stories of a great battle, but without their leader. Scarface says you abandoned them in their time of need." Tsina Taher stood before the council fire, still weak from his injuries but holding himself with the dignity expected of a war chief. Around him sat the elders and senior warriors of his band, their faces painted with the serious expressions they wore when dealing with matters of life and death. I was injured, Sina Taher said simply. My horse fell, and I struck my head on rocks. When I woke, days had passed and our enemies were searching for me. I had to wait until it was safe to return. And where did you wait? Asked Scarface, his voice carrying a tone of insolent challenge that made several of the elders frown. Who gave you shelter while your warriors wondered if their leader was dead or captured? This was the moment Sina Taher had been dreading. He could lie, make up a story about hiding in caves or being helped by Mexican. 3 months passed after the terrible discovery that had torn both their worlds apart. Winter settled over the Texas frontier with unusual harshness, bringing bitter winds and snow that piled up against cabin walls and made travel nearly impossible. For Rose McKenna, the cold weather was both a blessing and a curse. It kept away most of the neighbors who might have continued to harass her, but it also made the loneliness of her exile even more complete. She had not left Texas as the men had demanded. Where could she go? Her family back in Missouri had long since given up on her, disapproving of her decision to stay on the frontier after her husband's death. She had no money for travel, and besides, this was her home. She had buried her husband in the small cemetery behind her cabin, and she couldn't bear the thought of leaving him behind. Instead, she had prepared for a siege of sorts. She had gathered extra firewood, preserved as much food as possible from her garden, and settled in to wait for spring and whatever it might bring. The few people who still needed her healing services came to her cabin under cover of darkness, ashamed to be seen seeking help from the woman their community had branded a traitor. It was during one of these secret visits that Rose first heard the stories. Mrs. Caldwell came to her door on a snowy February night, carrying her youngest child, who was burning with fever. The woman looked exhausted and desperate, having walked 3 miles through the snow because her husband forbade her from seeking Rose's help during daylight hours. Please, she whispered as Rose opened her door. Little Mary's been sick for days and nothing I do helps. I know what people say about you, but you saved my oldest boy from the pneumonia last winter, and I don't know where else to turn. Rose took the sick child without hesitation, her heart breaking for the mother's desperation and fear. As she worked to bring down the fever with cool cloths and willow bark tea, Mrs. Caldwell sat in her kitchen and spoke in hushed tones about the strange things that had been happening around the territory. There have been attacks, she said, glancing nervously at Rose's windows as if afraid someone might be listening. But not the kind we're used to. 3 different families have been hit by Comanche raiders in the past month, but instead of losing their livestock and lives, they've been saved. Rose looked up from the sick child. Saved? What do you mean, Mrs. Caldwell's voice dropped even lower. The Johnson family was surrounded by warriors 2 weeks ago. They thought they were going to die, especially after the Indians took them captive. But then another Indian appeared, a lone warrior who spoke to the raiders in their own language. There was some kind of argument, and the next thing the Johnsons knew, they were being released. The lone warrior even gave them food and water for their journey home. Rose felt her heart skip a beat, but she kept her voice steady. That sounds like a miracle. That's not all, Mrs. Caldwell continued. The Patterson family. You remember Bill Patterson, who rode out here with those other men? His youngest daughter wandered away from their farm and got lost in the snow. They searched for her for 2 days with no luck. Then she just walked up to their door, saying a kind Indian man had found her and brought her most of the way home, making sure she could see their chimney smoke before he disappeared. The child's fever was breaking now, her breathing becoming easier and more natural. Rose continued her work, but her mind was racing with the implications of what she was hearing. People are starting to talk, Mrs. Caldwell said quietly. Some say there's a ghost Indian who protects white families. Others think it might be, well, they think it might be Iron Wolf himself, but changed somehow. Different from what he used to be. Rose's hands never paused in their work, but inside, her heart was soaring. She knew with absolute certainty who this mysterious protector was. Sina Taher was out there somewhere, living between 2 worlds that had both rejected him, using his skills and knowledge to save innocent people regardless of their race or background. When Mrs. Caldwell left that night with her healthy child, Rose sat by her fire and allowed herself to cry, not from sadness but from a mixture of joy and heartbreak. Sina Taher had chosen the path she had hoped he would choose. the path of protection and healing rather than revenge and hatred. But he was paying the same price she was paying, complete isolation from everything and everyone he had once called home. Spring arrived early that year, and with it came the most shocking news of all. Tom Bradley himself brought the story to Rose's door, appearing one morning in late March with an expression she had never seen on his face before, confusion mixed with something that might have been shame. "Rose," he said, standing awkwardly on her doorstep with his hat in his hands, "I need to tell you something, and I need to ask your forgiveness." Rose stared at him in amazement. This was the man who had discovered her secret, who had led the charge to drive her from her home, who had branded her a traitor in front of the entire community. Now he stood before her looking like a man whose entire world had been turned upside down. "What is it, Tom?" she asked, stepping aside to let him enter her cabin. Bradley sat heavily at her kitchen table and ran his hands through his graying hair. "It's about my boy, Jacob," he said quietly. "My youngest. You remember him. He's 22 now, works on my ranch." Rose nodded. She remembered Jacob Bradley as a quiet young man who had always been polite to her, unlike his father. 3 days ago, Jacob was driving cattle to the railhead when he got caught in that bad storm that came through, Bradley continued. His horse threw him and he broke his leg bad. Real bad. Bones sticking out and everything. He was lying there in the mud, bleeding and probably dying when he appeared. Rose felt her breath catch. "Who appeared, Tom?" Bradley looked up at her with eyes that were haunted and confused. "Iron Wolf. The man you were helping. He found Jacob lying there helpless, and instead of killing him or just riding away, he helped him. Set his leg like he knew what he was doing, made a splint from tree branches, even built a fire to keep him warm through the night." The story poured out of Bradley in a rush, as if he needed to get rid of it before it poisoned him from the inside. "Jacob says the Indian spoke some English, asked him where he hurt, told him to stay still while he worked. When morning came, Iron Wolf helped Jacob onto his horse and led him almost all the way back to our ranch. He only disappeared when he saw our buildings in the distance." Rose felt tears running down her cheeks, but she didn't try to hide them. "What did Jacob say about him?" "That's the thing," Bradley said, shaking his head in bewilderment. "Jacob said he was gentle and careful, like he was handling something precious. Said his hands were steady and sure when he set the bone, and he kept talking to Jacob in a calm voice, even though Jacob couldn't understand most of the words. Said he felt safer with that Indian than he's ever felt with some white men." Bradley paused and looked directly at Rose for the first time since entering her cabin. "Jacob asked me what Iron Wolf had done to deserve his reputation, asked me if I had ever actually seen him do any of the terrible things people say he's done. And you know what, Rose? I couldn't give him a good answer. All I could tell him were stories I'd heard from other people, stories that had been told and retold until nobody remembered what was true and what was just fear talking." Rose reached across the table and placed her hand on Bradley's weathered arm. "Tom, what are you trying to tell me?" "I'm trying to say I was wrong," he said, his voice breaking slightly. "Wrong about him and wrong about you. You saw something in that man that the rest of us were too scared and angry to see. You saw his heart, didn't you?" Rose nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. Bradley stood up and walked to her window, looking out at the prairie that stretched endlessly toward the horizon. "There have been 8 incidents now," he said quietly. 8 times when Iron Wolf has appeared to help white families in danger. The Morrison children when they got trapped in that flash flood. The Hendersons when their wagon broke down in Indian territory. Even old Pete Sullivan when he had that heart attack while checking his cattle. He turned back to Rose with wonder in his eyes. Each time people expected to die, and instead they found themselves protected by the very man they feared most. What kind of person does that, Rose? What kind of man saves the children of people who have tried to kill him? "A good man," Rose whispered. "A man with a heart big enough to see past hatred to the people who need help." Bradley nodded slowly. "I've been talking to the other men who rode out here that day. We want to make this right, Rose. We want you to know that you're welcome back in our community, and we're sorry for the way we treated you." Rose appreciated the gesture. But she knew that some things couldn't be undone with simple apologies. The trust that had been broken would take time to rebuild, and there would always be some people who would never forgive her for choosing compassion over prejudice. But that afternoon, something happened that changed everything. Rose was working in her garden when she heard a horse approaching. She looked up to see a lone rider coming across the prairie, and her heart stopped when she recognized the graceful way he sat in the saddle, the proud set of his shoulders, the long black hair flowing behind him in the wind.